In the depths of time, where immortality breeds arrogance and power flows like wine, there exists a truth that even the eternal must face. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in the ability to die. This truth, learned at terrible cost, haunts the memories of those few who survive to tell the tale. The crystal goblet trembled slightly in Thaler's ancient hands as he lifted it to his lips, the rich elvish wine catching the tavern's candlelight like liquid rubies. His silver hair, worn long in the tradition of high elven bards, cascaded over shoulders that had carried the weight of centuries. Around him, the warm glow of the tavern cast dancing shadows on faces that had seen empires rise and fall, yet none bore the haunted look that plagued his ageless features. The evening had begun innocently enough, with songs of glory and tales of adventure, but as the wine flowed freely and tongues loosened, the conversation had turned to darker matters. Thaler had watched the younger elves, both wood and highborn, discuss their recent encounters with human settlements. Their words carried that familiar tone of subtle superiority that he himself had once possessed, before that fateful night that changed everything. "It seems like all the humans do is die," he said, breaking his long silence. The words fell heavy in the room, causing several of his listeners to exchange uneasy glances. The statement hung in the air like morning mist, uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. A young wood elf maiden, her green dress adorned with autumn leaves, tried to change the subject, but Thaler raised his hand, his ancient eyes holding a story that demanded to be told. "Before I speak of death," he said, his voice carrying the melody of centuries, "let me tell you of life as it was before the long peace." He settled back in his chair, and the tavern seemed to grow quieter, as if the very walls leaned in to listen. "I was young then, though young for our kind still meant I had seen 2 centuries pass. The world was different. We were different." In the corner, a minstrel quietly set aside his lute, sensing that tonight's entertainment would come from a darker place. The tavern keeper, an ancient wood elf whose eyes had witnessed countless stories unfold within these walls, began placing fresh bottles of wine on the tables without being asked. Some tales, he knew, required more than just courage to tell. They required the sweet numbness that only centuries-old elvish wine could provide. "Our kind ruled the forests and mountains then," Thaler continued, his voice taking on a haunting melody that spoke of ancient sorrows. "We had just escaped the Fey wilds, and our hearts still carried the wild magic of that realm. We were not the peaceful artisans and scholars you see today. No, we were warriors, conquerors, proud and terrible in our power." The flames in the hearth seemed to dim as Thaler's words painted pictures of a darker time. Professor Eldrian from the University of Arcane Arts drew closer, his normally pristine robes wrinkled from a long day of teaching. Even he, with all his academic knowledge, leaned forward like an eager student, sensing that this was no ordinary tale of elven history. "I served in a raiding party then." Thaler's fingers traced the rim of his goblet, creating an eerie singing sound that matched the tension in his voice. Though served might be too generous a term, I was little more than a pack mule, carrying supplies and cooking meals for my betters. But even in that humble role, I witnessed the might of our people at its peak, and its devastating fall. His eyes grew distant, seeing past the tavern walls, to a time when elven arrogance ran unchecked. The warmages I traveled with were artists of destruction, 50 of them, each capable of calling down lightning or turning the very earth against their enemies. Their leader was Lady Cylindrial, a high elf whose beauty was matched only by her mastery of battle magic. Thaler's voice softened as he spoke of her, memory painting a picture more vivid than any artist's brush. She had fought in the Fey Wars, and her scars glowed with ethereal light when she cast her spells. But what the histories don't tell you is how she would sing lullabies to her war griffin every night, or how she carried a pressed flower from her homeland in a locket around her neck. The histories never capture these small details, these fragments of life that make us who we are. He paused, fingering the scar on his wrist. Or who we were. The tavern had grown so quiet that even the crackling of the hearth seemed intrusive. Outside, the eternal forest of the wood elves whispered its ancient secrets, but inside, time itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the story to unfold. "Our target that night was a human settlement," Thaler continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing his audience to lean in closer. "It was newly built by their standards, though it had stood for several human generations. The kind of target we favored, far enough from their major cities to avoid immediate retaliation, but prosperous enough to be worth the effort. The humans had cultivated the land well, turning forest into fertile fields that would feed our people through the coming winter. He reached for the fresh bottle of wine the tavern keeper had silently provided, but his hand trembled slightly as he poured. We arrived at dusk, when the autumn sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold. The village was larger than most, with perhaps 500 souls within its wooden walls. But it wasn't the villagers who concerned us. It was the mage. A chill seemed to sweep through the tavern, though no door had opened. Taylor's eyes reflected the candlelight like ancient pools of sorrow as he continued. We had faced human mages before, you see, impressive for their short-lived race, certainly, but nothing our battle-tested war mages couldn't handle, or so we thought. But this mage, understood something about power that we, in our immortal arrogance, had never considered. The scar on his wrist seemed to pulse with a memory of its own as Taylor leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower, pulling his audience deeper into the horror that was about to unfold. The candlelight flickered as Thalar's gaze swept across his captivated audience. Even the tavern's resident cat, usually prowling for scraps, sat still in the shadows, its eyes reflecting the same eerie tension that gripped the room. The mage's tower stood at the edge of their graveyard, Thalar continued, his voice carrying the weight of ancient dread. It was a common enough sight in human settlements. Their dead always seemed to need such careful tending. We thought nothing of it at the time, except that it would make our approach easier. The shadows of tombstones would provide excellent cover for our advance. He paused, taking another sip of wine, his hand steadier now as the familiar warmth of the alcohol helped push back the cold memories. Lady Cylindrial gathered us for the final briefing as the sun set. I remember how her silver hair caught the last rays of daylight, how her battle armor seemed to drink in the gathering darkness. "Remember," she told us, "quick and clean. The mage dies first, then we secure the village before dawn." A bitter laugh escaped his lips, hollow and empty as a tomb. Quick and clean. Such simple words. Such a simple plan. We had done this dozens of times before. The humans would wake to find their mage dead, their defenses overwhelmed, and their village under new management. Some would flee, others would submit, and life would go on, just under Elven rule instead of human. The professor shifted in his seat, his academic curiosity warring with growing unease. "But the tower," Thalar continued, "that damned tower looked wrong, though none of us could say why at first. It seemed to be sinking into the ground, as human buildings often did. Their short lives meant they rarely built things to last. We assumed the foundations were failing, as they always did with human construction." His fingers traced the scar on his wrist again, an unconscious gesture that had become a tell for the horror about to unfold in his tale. 15 of our best war mages approached the tower first, moving like shadows between the tombstones. I watched from the tree line, carrying Lady Cylindrial's spare staff and emergency potions. The moon was high and full, casting everything in silver light that made the tombstones look like rows of teeth in a giant's mouth. The tavern keeper moved to light more candles, but Taylor waved him away. The growing darkness seemed fitting for what was to come. The first sign that something was wrong came from the ground itself. Valorian, our scout, noticed that the soil felt wrong under his feet. Too soft, too loose, as if it had been recently turned. But this was a graveyard. Soil was always being turned for new burials. "We should have realized." His voice trailed off, and for a moment the only sound was the soft crackle of the dying fire. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, taking on a quality that made several listeners shiver involuntarily. "Have you ever seen a human graveyard in an established settlement? Really looked at it, not just glanced at the stones and monuments, but understood what they represent?" The wood elf maiden in the green dress shook her head, her earlier discomfort forgotten in the grip of the tale. "We elves," Thalar explained, "we die so rarely that each death is marked with grand monuments, elaborate tombs, entire gardens of remembrance. But humans die with such frequency that they must be practical about it. They bury their dead in neat rows, layer upon layer, generation upon generation." His eyes took on a faraway look, seeing not the tavern walls but that moonlit night from long ago. The tower wasn't sinking. The ground around it had risen with layers upon layers of human dead. 4,000 bodies at least, each one accompanied by the grief and loss of their loved ones. 4,000 vessels of potential power for a necromancer who had spent decades preparing for just such an attack. The temperature in the tavern seemed to drop as Thalar leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper now. We never saw the spell coming. There was no dramatic gesture, no incantation, no warning at all, just a sudden silence, as if the very air was holding its breath. And then, the silence in the tavern mirrored that fateful night. As Thalar's voice grew hoarse with remembered terror, the ground began to move. Not like an earthquake, I'd seen those before. This was different. It was as if the earth itself was breathing. The neat rows of graves began to shift and bulge like something was pushing up from underneath. And then the screaming started. His fingers clutched the wine goblet so tightly his knuckles turned white. Not screams of the living. Those would come later. These were the screams of the dead. Thousands of voices crying out at once as they were torn from their rest. The first hand that burst from the soil was little more than bone and scraps of cloth, but it moved with terrible purpose. Then another appeared, and another, until the entire graveyard seemed to be reaching for the sky. Our more warmages reacted instantly, of course. Lady Cylindriel's battle cry rang out as she unleashed a blast of pure arcane energy that would have leveled a small fortress. The magic tore through the rising dead, shredding rotting flesh and splintering ancient bones. But for every corpse she destroyed, 10 more emerged from the earth. The professor's face had turned an ashen grey as understanding dawned. The emotional resonance, he whispered. All that grief, all that loss. Yes, Taylor nodded grimly. Each death leaves an imprint, a well of power that most necromancers can barely tap. But this one had been patient. He had spent decades nurturing that power, letting it grow with each new burial, each fresh tragedy, and now he wielded the accumulated sorrow of generations. I saw Velorian fall first. 3 corpses grabbed him before he could teleport to safety. His magic tore 2 of them apart, but the third wore the remains of an elven battle dress. One of our own, fallen in some forgotten skirmish and buried among the humans. The shock of recognition cost him his life. Taylor's voice cracked as he continued. Lady Cylindriel fought like a demon. Her magic illuminated the night like a second sun as she carved paths through the undead horde. But even she couldn't fight the sheer numbers. The last I saw of her, she was still fighting, her war griffin's screams mixing with her battle songs as they were pulled down into that seething mass of death. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. I dropped everything, the staff, the potions, my pride, and I ran for the only shelter I could see, the village well. I climbed down into that dark hole and pressed myself against the slimy stones, trying to make myself as small as possible. Above me, I could hear the sounds of battle turning into sounds of slaughter. The tavern was completely silent now, every ear straining to catch his next words. For 3 days I hid in that well. 3 days of listening to the dead march past, of hearing distant screams as the horde spread across the countryside. 3 days of wondering if each shadow that passed over the well's mouth would be the one that discovered me. His hand moved unconsciously to his wrist again, to that scar that seemed to pulse in the dim light. On the 4th day, when thirst finally drove me to risk climbing out, I emerged into a changed world. The village was gone, reduced to ashes and splintered wood. The graveyard was an open wound in the earth, every grave torn open from below, and in the distance, I could see the smoke rising from what had once been the proud elven city of Silverspire. The horde rampaged for weeks before the necromantic energy finally dissipated. By then, they had destroyed 3 elven settlements and countless smaller outposts. The humans lost several villages too, but they rebuilt, as they always do. We learned a different lesson. The bard's eyes swept across his audience, now leaning forward in their seats, their immortal faces marked by a new understanding of mortality. That night changed everything, not just for me, but for our entire people. We had always seen human deaths as insignificant, brief candles snuffed out by time. We never understood that each death was a stone added to a mountain of power, each loss a thread in a tapestry of potential energy. The humans rebuilt their village, of course, they always do. Within a generation, new houses stood on the ashes of the old ones. New graves filled the torn earth of the old graveyard. Life went on, as it always does for them. But now there was something different. The elven raids stopped. Not just on that village, but everywhere. We finally understood what we were truly dealing with. Thalar paused to refill his glass, his hands steadier now as the tale neared its end. You see, that necromancer taught us something that our immortal minds had failed to grasp. Humans don't just die, they leave behind power. Every death carries the weight of grief, the energy of loss, the potential of unfinished business, and they die so very, very often. Think about it, he continued, his voice taking on an urgent tone. In the time it takes one of us to master a single school of magic, how many humans have lived and died in even the smallest village? How much power accumulates in their graveyards, their crypts, their catacombs? We thought their short lives made them weak. Instead, their brief existence makes them more dangerous than we could have imagined. The young wood elf maiden who had tried to change the subject earlier now spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. But surely that was just one necromancer, surely not all humans. That's not the point, Tylar interrupted gently. The point is that we never saw the potential until it was too late. We looked at their short lives and saw weakness. We never considered that death itself could be a source of power. And that's why we must never forget this lesson. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the full extent of the scar on his wrist, a perfect handprint burned into his flesh. This is my reminder. A parting gift from one of the undead as I climbed out of that well. It never healed properly, magic wounds rarely do, but I keep it uncovered to remember what I learned that night. The tavern keeper began lighting the lamps now, pushing back the darkness that had gathered during the tale, but the shadows seemed to linger in the corners, as if reluctant to release their hold on the listeners. So, the next time you find yourself pitying humans for their brief lives, Taylor concluded, his voice heavy with warning, remember this tale. Remember that their greatest weakness may also be their greatest strength. Remember that in their graveyards lie not just bones and memories, but power beyond our immortal understanding. He lifted his glass one final time, the wine catching the lamplight like blood. All the humans do is die, he repeated, his earlier words, but now they carried a different weight. And we must pray they never fully realize what that means. As the gathered elves began to disperse, shaken by the tale, Taylor remained at his table, his ancient eyes fixed on something only he could see. Outside, the eternal forest continued its whispered conversations, but now its secrets seemed darker, more ominous. In the distance, a church bell tolled in some human village, marking another passing, another death, another small addition to that ever-growing well of power. The high elf bard closed his eyes, listening to that distant bell, and wondered, not for the first time, how many more deaths it would take before another human realized what that necromancer had understood. And in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw again the rising dead, and heard the screams of immortals, learning too late that sometimes the greatest power lies not in living forever, but in how one chooses to die. Thanks for joining me for this dark tale from the depths of Elven history. If you enjoyed this story of immortality, hubris, and the hidden power of death, make sure to explore more tales from the Eternal Realms. Each story holds secrets waiting to be uncovered, lessons carved in the bones of time. Want to hear more about Lady Cylendriel's final battle? Or perhaps you're curious about other encounters between elves and humans that shaped their uneasy peace? Let me know in the comments below what ancient mysteries you'd like to unravel next. Until our next gathering, remember, in every graveyard lies a story, and in every death, a power waiting to be understood. May your days be long, and your wisdom deeper than the oldest tomb. Don't forget to join our community of lore seekers by subscribing and ring that notification bell to ensure you never miss another tale from the archives of eternity. This is Tayala, your immortal storyteller, bidding you farewell until our paths cross again in the candlelit corners of memory.